Former President Donald Trump making these remarks there in Dallas, accepting the endorsement of the National Rifle Association. Of course, he is there accepting that endorsement, campaigning on days off while being in the courtroom for this hush money trial that is very rapidly nearing its end. And as the prosecution will soon rest their case, that means the defense is up, and there is one big question remaining there in New York City. Will the former president, Donald Trump, take the stand in his own defense in this criminal case? I do want to put up a live picture right now there in New York City as we're following this. The former president's attorney, it seems, don't have any answers, including whether Trump plans to take the stand, something he's suggested he'd like to do. Todd Blanche, one of Trump's attorneys, said Thursday his team anticipated reaching decision at some point. So we'll see if that happens. We want to bring into the conversation right now, friend of the program, attorney Dwane Cates. Dwane, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And of course, that is a big question on everyone's mind. And I think a lot of people are going back and forth. It's ultimately going to be up to Donald Trump. But what could happen this week if Donald Trump does take the stand?
Well, you know, it's always up to the defendant's choice of whether to take the stand or not. You have a constitutional right to not take the stand, and they supposedly can't use that against you. But please, President Trump, please listen to me. Do not take the stand. You're winning. Don't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The last couple of cases he testified in, he lost, okay, because he has a tendency to overstate his case, okay? And the people on that jury tended not like him anyway, and I don't think he's going to win anybody over by testifying, you know, and so he needs to just sit in his chair.
Yeah, that might be harder said than done for the former president that usually comes out during the courtroom. I do want to put up just a tweet right here from the Washington Post. After brashly declaring he wanted to testify in his criminal trial, it appears increasingly unlikely that Donald Trump will do so. The jury seemed poised to hear closing arguments within the next week. So you mentioned the fact that you urged the former president to potentially not take the stand. And he is not your typical defendant, but in terms of defendants, you typically advise them not to. Why is that case? Can you explain a little bit more why potentially he should not take the stand in your eyes?
I always make a decision, you know, towards the end of the prosecution's case, okay, because they have the burden of proof. And Donald Trump doesn't have to prove anything, okay? And so if the prosecution is having a trouble meeting their burden, and if I think that I'm ahead, okay, or have a hung jury at the end of the state's case, I don't want the defendant to testify. And I've had the defendant testify, you know, 25, 30% of the time in my cases, and they lost every one of them, okay? Because again, they generally think that they're smarter than everybody else and that they can talk their way out of it. And the problem is they usually talk their way into it.
That is a very interesting case as well. And like I said, Trump is not your typical defendant as well. And if you think you are ahead, you might not want to take the stand. But let's get into a little bit of this because like you said, also some of those cases that he did take the stand, he did not win. Those were civil cases as well. Is there any difference in terms of if he takes the stand, criminal versus civil?
Not really. I mean, the jurors in both cases are gonna be watching what he says, and I listened to some of the testimony in the civil cases, and I cringed because he overstated his position. Okay, he was making unbelievable remarks, as he tends to do. He loves to exaggerate. He loves to be larger than life, and that's not a problem on the campaign trail, but it is a problem when you're testifying in a case.
Yeah, and potentially about what he can and cannot say on the stand. In terms of those parameters set by the judge, what have we learned already about this? And maybe if he does decide to take the stand, how much closer will those parameters get?
Well, you know, again, Donald Trump is going to want to talk about things that he's not supposed to talk about. He's going to want to talk about the judge being biased. He's going to want to talk about the prosecution being biased. And that is not things that he can testify about in trial. There's going to be objections. There'll be a big deal. And I don't think that's going to endear him to anybody in this case. You know, if Donald Trump could get up and take the stand and with some amount of humility and tell a good story, okay, then he would be, that would work. But I don't think he can do that. I don't think he can be anything. I've worked with clients and I've trained clients and I've worked with them for their testimony, and every single time when they take the stand, they are who they are. Okay, you can't make them into something that they're not. And Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and he's going to be that if he takes the stand.
Yeah, and like you mentioned there, he is who he is, and we see that personality come through every time he steps out of the courtroom when he addresses the media before and after courtroom as well. And there is a gag order that he has violated numerous times as well. If he takes the stand as well, in terms of maybe the strength of the gag order, the strength of what he can and cannot say outside of the courtroom, does that change as well for the judge? Can he kind of implement different gag orders based on his own testimony?
Well, first of all, the gag order is a joke. Okay, I've never seen a gag order applied to only one person. And the gag orders are technically for the benefit of the defendant, so the defendant can get a fair trial, so the prosecution's not out there poisoning the jury pool. I've never seen a case where the defendant and the defendant only has a gag order. I mean, it's ridiculous. It really is, and that will be something that will probably go up on appeal if he loses, for sure.
All right, that makes sense as well. All right, just a live look there in New York City. This is Sunday, heading into Monday, a next case. And of course, we're going to shift gears a little bit. That was kind of a hypothetical. What if Donald Trump takes the stand? Let's get into more of the nitty gritty, what we learned over the last couple of weeks. Michael Cohen there on the stand last week. He's going to take the stand again on Monday, potentially wrapping up that testimony. You mentioned that you felt that potentially Trump's lawyers, Trump's side, is kind of ahead in this ordeal. What do we make of Cohen's testimony up until this point? And tomorrow, are we expecting to potentially hear the rest of the prosecution's case? Are they going to rest anytime soon?
I think they'll rest after Cohen. The thing that's going to be really interesting that's coming up is the redirect of Cohen, because the defense gets to do cross-examination of Cohen and they get to tear him apart, but the prosecution gets to try to rehabilitate him on the stand, and they get to try to explain some of his bizarre answers about things that that just don't make sense, and about his lies, and Cohen can say, well, yeah, gee, I lied back then, but I don't lie anymore. I'm a good guy now, and they can go through all that, and that's what they're going to try to do. They're going to try to rehabilitate him. I think they're going to rest. I don't know who else they could call at this point, and I don't know if the Trump team's going to call anybody, but there's a couple potential witnesses, but that's a game time decision that you got to make on the fly.
Yeah, Cohen could be one of the final witnesses of the 20 that the prosecutors have called so far during this some 3-week long case. I do have to ask you, because it kind of culminated earlier last week, Thursday, into the weekend as well. Is there anything in terms of the timing that you get 3 days, 2 days to prepare for this, like you mentioned, kind of a rebuttal to the cross-examination? Is that beneficial to the Trump defense team?
It's beneficial to kind of everybody, because you get a chance to sit back, regroup, and make plans for what's coming up, for the next week. Because again, things can change so much in a trial in the course of 5 hours that you may have to rethink your whole plan, coming into the next week. They've got Cohen, trapped in some things that are just bizarre and just not and blatantly not true statements. And so, I think they're going to hammer on that. They're going to come up with some things. If I were Trump's lawyers, I would want Michael Cohen to be the last person the jury hears before they go to deliberate, because I don't think the jury likes him. I've heard reports of people that are sitting in the courtroom, of people that are saying they have absolutely no idea. There's no organization to his statements. There's no, that everybody's confused about what he's saying and why he's saying it.
Yeah, and the jury has the ultimate kind of decision there on whether innocence or guilt. Of course, the burden of proof on the prosecutors as well. I do want to ask you, because you mentioned that Cohen could be the final witness on the stand, and then we get into closing arguments. We talked about opening statements, closing arguments. Kind of what's the theme of closing arguments, maybe in relation to what we heard from opening statements and all the witnesses. How important are closing arguments?
They're really important. What happens is you get all the evidence out during trial, and then you can argue reasonable inferences from the evidence. Okay, you can tell in closing arguments, you can tell the jury what to think of the evidence they just saw and why they should think that way. Okay, it's your chance to try to persuade them into doing that. Now, the prosecution, because they have the burden, gets to go first and last, which is primacy and recency, which is I always thought it's not fair, but they do have a pretty high burden, and I think the defense has to really harp on the fact of what that burden is and why they didn't meet it, because there's two lawyers on this. There's two lawyers on this jury panel, and for the life of me, I can't see how a lawyer with any integrity at all could sit and listen to all this and come up with a guilty verdict.
Yeah, and it potentially could sway some of the other juries, just members, just based on their experience in that, if it does get in the hands of the jury. Just based on this whole trial as well, the fact that it is a former president there sitting on this criminal trial as well, does that maybe expect the jury to take their time once they get to deliberations? Is that kind of the understanding potentially by you?
A little bit. You know, I sat on a jury when I was a third-year law student, and what generally happens with juries, when they go back, they'll pick a foreman, and when they pick the foreperson, what'll happen is generally they'll take a vote right then. They'll say, okay, how many think guilty? How many think not guilty? Okay, and then, you know, if it's unanimous, they may say, well, you know, let's discuss this a little bit first, but it could end pretty quick. I mean, I've done trials. I finished closing arguments, went to go to the cafeteria. Before I got there, my phone rang. The court called me back up, and the jury came back not guilty. So, you know, I had another case where, you know, 2.5 hours later, they came back guilty. So you just don't know. I've had juries out for 6 days. You have no idea what's going on in that jury room. I would love to have cameras in there and be privy to the conversations that they have, but nobody gets to.
Yep, and like you mentioned, no cameras there in the jury room, no cameras, video cameras in the courtroom. If former President Donald Trump takes a stand, I think a lot of people would want to watch that as well, but we are missing out on that. We'll get testimony and reports from inside the courtroom from the various entities that bring us those news. All right, Dwane Cates, anything else that you'd like to add? Because, of course, this is slowly wrapping up. It could be wrapping up Monday into this week. Anything else? Any parting words?
I'm really struck by the dichotomy of the two Michael Cohens, the cool, calm, collected Michael Cohen that's in the courtroom, and then the unhinged, Michael Cohen that's on his podcast, screaming and ranting about locking Donald Trump up. Two totally different people, and I think that's going to have an impact on the jury.
All right, that is a very good point as well. Michael Cohen there in the spotlight. A lot for this hush money payment there. Michael Cohen there paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 days before the 2016 election to stay quiet about an alleged affair with Trump. All right, Dwane, thank you again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.